Okay, thank you. Good evening and welcome. I'm Matt Harkins, Director of the Literary Arts Institute of the College of St. Benedict. And before I forget, I'd like to ask you to please turn off your phones in preparation for the reading tonight. I have to ask everyone that because I'm the last one to remember myself. I'm here to briefly introduce Jamel Brinkley, our Sister Mariella Gable Award winner for 2018-2019. Jamel's debut short story collection, A Lucky Man, was published by Grey Wolf Press this past May, and I want to thank Grey Wolf and the Manitou Fund for helping to make tonight's event possible. After the reading, we will have time for questions. There will also be books for sale, as well as a broadside created by Mary Bruno of Bruno Press. And Jamel will be available to sign both the book and the broadside. And as some of you have already realized, there is caffeine and sugar in that corner there. And if you haven't already availed yourself, or if you want some more, please, after the reading, feel free to do so. I want to take just a moment to talk about the Sister Mariella Gable Prize, which is given each year to an outstanding work of literature published by Grey Wolf Press. As many of you know, Sister Mariella was a beloved member of both St. Benedict's Monastery and the English department. She championed the work of Flannery O'Connor and J.F. Powers when they were still relatively unknown American writers. She also pushed against contemporary tastes and expectations, writing, quote, "Truth has a way of not being as nice as the insipid pink and white fiction we used to call Catholic," end quote. She preferred Chekhov's realism and argued that the best fiction offered, quote, "a reordering of love," end quote. Jamel's fiction is not pink and white. It is not nice, with the scare quotes, right? But it is deeply concerned with what love means, what it looks like, the unexpected twists that it takes, and what it costs. In the first story, Only a Bubble, the speaker tries to impress two young women at a party as he's trying to remember the seduction techniques of his philandering father. But the late-night sex doesn't end quite as the young man and his friend plan it to, for the young women force them to stare nakedly at who they are and what they are doing. Near the story's conclusion, the narrator wonders how his father must have understood him and how he, in turn, would likely find himself unable to help a son of his own. Quote, "Maybe observing what I did with my life would be his way of figuring everything out. I don't know. I don't know, but I keep imagining what it would be like to be a father to a boy who loves and believes in me, and, despite all our differences, wants nothing more than to be a man in my image. I see that spectral boy, my son, vividly, and feel frightened when he is near. I want to speak to him, but I have no idea what to say," end quote. The figures in many of these stories are survivors. They labor to draw real strength from the best parts of their past and to avoid being wrecked by the worst. And they try hard at times to figure out which is which. In the story, Everything the Mouth Eats, two brothers try to recover from a shared traumatic upbringing and years of distance. Knowing how to be hard, to deliver loving blows, is central to this story. And knowing that pain is part of intimacy, and that even conflict is a kind of play. I'm not going to try to sum up these stories in all their arresting and intimate and disturbing beauty, but this powerful collection marks a stunning debut. Please join me in welcoming Jamel Brinkley.
Hi, everybody. Does it sound okay? Yeah? Okay. Thanks so much for that welcome, Matt. And thanks to all of you for being here. Before I start reading, I want to say a few more words of thanks to the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University, the Literary Arts Institute, and the English Department for inviting me and for selecting my book to be awarded the 2018 Sister Mariella Gable Award, and for supporting my book's publication. It really means a lot to me, and I'm honored, so thank you. I also want to thank Matt, Rachel Marston, Jessica Harkins, Lori Moe, Chris Bolin, and Rachel Malis for organizing and ushering me around the two campuses over the last few days. Thanks to John Kendall, Matt Callahan, and again to Matt and all their students for inviting me into their classrooms. I want to thank Mary Bruno and Bruno Press for the creation of the beautiful broadside that was based on one of the stories in my collection. And finally, I want to thank President Hinton and all the other students I got to meet over the past few days. Thank you so much for your kindness and your hospitality. I really appreciate it. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to do for this reading, I considered reading an entire story, which I've never done. I've never been given this much time to read. But I decided against that, actually. And I decided against that because I'm sort of taking my lead from poetry here, which I love, even though I'm a fiction writer. And I think it was Walter Pater who said that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. And to me, I think poetry gets closest to that, to the condition of music. And because of that, I feel like all the other written forms of art actually aspire to the condition of poetry. And, you know, as I said, I love poetry. Not only do I love poetry, I'm sort of jealous of poets themselves, right? They throw really good parties, in my experience. They tend to be better looking than fiction writers, in my experience. And at their readings, they get to offer a selection of their works, right? So they'll read a poem, stop, read another poem, stop, read another poem, stop. And what they get with this selection of poems is what my friend calls the poetry moo, so the that happens after someone finishes a poem. And I'm just really jealous of that. Not that you have to do the poetry moo for me, but all this is to say that my reading tonight is sort of modeled on the way that a poetry reading might work. And so I'm going to offer you a selection of 3 stories from the collection, each with their own little arc. So you won't hear an entire story tonight, but you'll get sort of a piece of each, a piece hopefully that feels like it has its own coherence. So what I'm going to do is start with one of the youngest characters in the collection. And it's from a story that Matt referred to, Everything the Mouth Eats. You don't need to know anything. I think I'm just going to launch right in. Carlos and I refer to each other as brothers, but technically we're half-brothers. I was born to our mother in North Carolina, and he was born in New York. Our mother met the man who would become my stepfather, Carlos's father, in Brooklyn, when she was struggling and unhappy with her job at Montgomery Ward. He was a career counselor then, and in those days, though I find it hard to believe, he treated my mother with great kindness. She says he gave her sound advice, but more important, he took an interest in her beyond her employment, an interest that alleviated her loneliness. Soon enough, they were seeing each other, and then we were leaving Brooklyn for the Bronx to move in with him. My own father is a man I have no memory or evidence of. The first clear images I have of my stepfather are from the day we moved when I was 4. He lived near the top of a housing project in the South Bronx, in the same apartment where he had grown up. I gawked at the sheer size and formidable brick of the building, and of the buildings that stood around it, throwing down enormous shadows everywhere, and so he too became impressive. He was an overweight but striking Puerto Rican man with large hands, light skin, and wide, active eyes. With his thick black horseshoe mustache, he was trying to approximate or even surpass Willie Colon, whose face would appear again and again if you flipped through the sleeves of his record collection. I was so impressed, which is to say frightened, by this building, by this man, by this new scale of being, that I peed my pants, just as we were about to board the elevator that would take us up to our home. When it wasn't broken, that elevator took us to and from our home on the 10th floor for over 10 years. In the first of those years, my mother became pregnant with my brother. I don't remember anything about his birth or his first appearance in our apartment, but I do remember feeling vaguely indignant that I would no longer be an only child. I also remember that Carlos was a fussy baby, not allowing anyone but our mother to hold him, though later, with no effort or enthusiasm on my part, he suddenly warmed up to me. One of his first words, frequently yelled from his crib, was Badi, the nonsensical pet name he had invented for me. There was something antic and skittish about him, however, so I didn't feel whatever connection I was supposed to. Carlos's father had a game he liked to play, especially during the time our mother was taking evening classes in accounting, when we, the 2 boys, were alone with him. He began it as soon as Carlos could talk. He would take one of us onto his lap and say, "Who do you belong to?" We quickly learned that the correct answer was Daddy, but the speed of our learning was less important than the speed of our response, and we could never respond quickly enough. As soon as he asked the question, even if it seemed that the answer came right away, even if the answer interrupted the question, he would begin relentlessly tickling whichever boy was sitting on him. Countless times his thick fingers would clamp onto my narrow rib cage, and no matter how many times I screamed the word Daddy, I would be left gasping and nearly crying. Carlos was also a subject of this regime of laughter and filial affection, yelling and thrashing until he slid from his father's lap and shared with me the mercy of finally making it down to the floor. Afterward, we would often be forced to massage his feet. He'd be on the couch, and we'd still be on the floor, each of us with a bare foot. I remember the sour smell, the hard skin on his sole and under the big toe. We were only slightly menaced by this game. If he came home from work and sent us trembling to the floor, then it meant he was in a good mood. On such evenings, he might also play some of his pop records. With this music blasting out of the speakers, he would dance, his brow knitted, his bottom lip sucked into his mouth, spinning and sliding in his thin dress socks. I would join in mostly by jumping up and down. Carlos moved with more grace and sophistication. He understood his limbs and his hips, and he understood time. Even then, he was a skilled and intelligent dancer. At that point, Carlos's father was working as an officer with the Department of Probation. Once, when my brother and I were out of school for some odd holiday, my stepfather took us to work with him for the first time. The building where he worked in Lower Manhattan, down on Center Street, was imposing and severe. A place that supposedly handled matters of justice, but which nevertheless looked merely like a prison. The three of us went through a metal detector and rode an elevator to one of the highest floors. It was morning, but my brother and I were allowed to get potato chips, red licorice, and soda from the vending machines. As we made our way down the hall, Carlos's father had us peek into certain offices and cubicles so he could show us off to his coworkers. After we got to his office, a middle-aged white woman with a long neck and her hair in a tight bun came in to chat. She pointed to my brother and said, "Oh my God, is this your son?" "They both are." "Well, this one looks just like you, the same smile, the wavy hair. Look at his adorable baby fat." "These are my boys," he said. "But this tall guy, he isn't your biological, right?" He looked at her then in that familiar way. His eyelids parted as far as they could go, the orbs themselves seeming to have moved a full inch out of their sockets. She appeared to be the sort of person who walked around the office saying things she shouldn't say. If he'd had the proper authority, he might have fired her on the spot. Instead, he stood behind me and put a strong hand on each of my shoulders. "Yes, he is," he told her calmly. "They both are, like I said." Everyone in that room, except maybe Carlos, who was very young, though even he may have sensed it, knew this was a ridiculous statement. My stepfather's colleagues had to be at least somewhat familiar with the basic facts of his home life. Also, I looked nothing like him, and at the time, I looked nothing like Carlos. His hair was curlier and softer, mine lighter by a few shades. Only later would a few similarities of nose and cheek from our mother become apparent. It was possible and less absurd that I had been grabbed off the corner of Center Street for the purpose of an office gag. The woman pinched her mouth shut and then went out the door, leaving us alone in the room with my stepfather's lie. "You are my son," he said, not gently. "You know that, right?" The look on his face wasn't very different from the one he had given the woman, and his voice was a double voice. I heard the unmistakable command in the lower one, so I nodded. He sat down in the chair next to his desk and made Carlos and me stand together before him. A distance from my brother opened suddenly, as if each of the years between our births were a tract of desert now stretched between us. "Who do you belong to?" he asked us. There was no threat of tickling this time, which somehow made things worse. "Daddy," we said. After Carlos's father insisted in his office that he was my father too, I warped my laughter into screams whenever he tickled me. I no longer looked him in the face when I answered, "Daddy." In addition to taking evening classes, our mother had also started a day job, which meant that I had to walk Carlos to and from our nearby school and babysit him until an adult got home. In those unsupervised hours after school, we never had much to say to each other. We played, however, and I began to play rough with him. Back then, we watched professional wrestling on television, and it was easy to persuade him to let me try out the moves. When we played this way, I always took on the role of the villain, the heel. I'd pick him up and slam his body onto our dingy couch, bend his spine against my knee, apply various chokeholds, pretend to smash his head into the wall. We both knew that pro wrestling was fake, at times barely on the threshold of convincing physicality, and we played in the same spirit. This usually extinguished the aggression that flared within me. But one day, when I was in 8th grade and Carlos was in 3rd, we wrestled for a long time, until I had him in a chokehold called a sleeper. I was behind him with one arm wrapped around his neck and the other cradling the side of his head. This was routine for us. I would pretend to squeeze his windpipe, and he would pretend to gasp for breath. swinging his arms stiffly in the air until he feigned unconsciousness. But this time, all I saw in my mind was my biceps. Carlos flailed as I kept flexing it, and I was fascinated by the way a part of my body could be hardened into stone. Even when his weight sagged against me and he stopped flailing, I kept on with the routine, now acting as the referee. I let him slump against the front of the couch, then lifted his arm by the wrist and let it drop. I lifted it again and it dropped, and he fell onto his side. If his arm dropped a third time, it would mean I had put him to sleep and that I had won the match. But I never won this way. Carlos had never let his arm drop a third time. He'd hold it in the air to signal consciousness, and his eyes would pop open, and then he would go on the attack. That afternoon, however, his arm did drop a third time. I raised my fists in victory and stomped around the living room, jeering at the imaginary crowd that surrounded us as my brother lay on the floor. Full of uncaged power, I laughed and pointed at him to show the crowd how weak their hero was. I planted my foot on his hip and raised my fists again, but when he didn't move, I began to get scared. His fingers were curled like shriveled leaves, and one of his legs was bent at an unnatural angle. I nudged him with my foot. Was he breathing? I squatted beside his heaped body and began to shake him. Tears ran down to my nostrils and my jaw. "Carlos, I'm sorry. Please wake up," I kept saying. "Carlos, wake up. I'm sorry. Please wake up. I'm so sorry." When he finally woke up, his squinting eyes blinked with confusion. Maybe it was because he realized what had happened, or because he saw my tears, but he started crying too. He held his arms out toward me, but I backed away, afraid. In this moment, how could either of us think touch was a good thing? I wiped my cheeks. "Why didn't you breathe?" I said. "You're not supposed to stop breathing. Why didn't you say something?" He kept nodding, accepting the blame as he cried. "But you can't tell," I said. "Carlos, you can't tell what happened. We'll get in trouble. We both will. We'll get a beating, so you can't tell." Carlos never did tell on me. He was convinced that I had saved us from a beating, and he may have even thought I had saved his life. In gratitude, he built a little religion and installed me as its godhead. This went beyond a younger sibling's normal admiration for his elder. In a way, I had once again become Badi, the alpha of his first and most private language. He was so single-minded in his devotion that thereafter, when his father tickled him and asked, "Who do you belong to?" it was a shock that he didn't respond by naming me. So that's the first little piece I wanted to share with you. And again, that's from a story called Everything the Mouth Eats. And obviously the relationship, the primary relationship there is between the narrator and his younger brother. The next selection I want to read for you is from a story earlier in the collection, but the characters are older. The story is called Juvet, 1996. And there's a brother relationship here too, but in the section that I'm going to read for you, I think what the narrator is wrestling with more than his relationship with his brother is his relationship with his mother and with his father. So this is from Juvet, 1996. The narrator's name is Ty. All I wanted was $15 to go to the barber shop, but the thought of asking for it made me feel like punching a wall. It stressed me the hell out to ask Ma for anything, especially that summer when I decided to leave my boyhood behind. Pop would have known just what to say to calm me down or make me laugh. He wasn't around anymore, though, and he had stopped responding to my letters. So I went to our room to gather myself and practice my appeal, but of course my little brother was there, too bizarre to ignore. Omari still had on his stupid rubber mask, a caricature of a great horned owl. A candy cigarette poked out at an angle from under its mottled beak. He was sitting at our desk, his butt swallowing the chair, and the clock radio played that boring white people music he liked. The oscillating fan rattled as it blew his newspaper clippings across the floor. Our room was strewn with these sheets of taped together headlines. As he paged through a neighbor's discarded daily news, a few caught my eye. Homeless youth under house arrest. Death named country's top killer. One armed boy applauds kindness of strangers. Together, they formed a patchwork calendar of the world's absurdity. A pathetic cloud of chalky smoke made of powdered sugar fell from the tip of Omari's cigarette. He'd found something he liked, a small but representative peculiarity. After testing his scissors on the air, he slowly snipped out a headline, making a show of it. "September's the weirdest month," he said. The cigarette bobbed up and down under the beak as he spoke. "September just started, dummy." "I can already tell." He rose and stretched. At 11, he was nearly as tall as I was and broad like Pop, his body an unchiseled slab. The ear tufts of his mask were sharp enough to scratch you. He squeezed between the fan and our bunk bed and went to the window. Though the kitchen was on the other side of the apartment, we could hear sink water speeding through the pipes. We lived on the second floor of our building, not even high enough to see the top of the tree outside. Leaves from a bough pressed against the window. In a month, the view would be pretty, the panes tessellated in autumn shades. But it wasn't so nice now. When I was younger, right when Pop stopped coming around, I had nightmares about that tree breaking through the glass and reaching inside to grab me with its branches. "I invited somebody over today," Omari sang. He gestured toward the window frame. Apparently, his newest imaginary friend was there. "Her name's Angela." "Who cares?" I said. Omari turned his face toward me, twisting his neck as far as it would go. He unwrapped the paper from the cigarette and bent the hard gum until it broke. Reaching under the beak, which curved from the bridge of his nose, he slipped the pieces into his mouth. The black and amber eyes of his mask were large and round, but the freaky thing was Omari's eyes within those eyes. They stared directly at me now, 2 pennies sunk in a bucket. Where we lived, it didn't matter what a room was called. Ma would wash her hair in the kitchen, careful when she was done rinsing not to hit her head on the bottom of the cabinet. Sometimes she'd take phone calls in the bathroom or go in there to listen to the radio. When she was sick of me fighting with Omari, she'd take her dinner plate into her bedroom and go out to eat in peace on the fire escape. Now she was in the kitchen washing dishes. She used scalding hot water and never wore rubber gloves. Her hands were tough, long and deeply lined. She was tough, with wiry, muscular arms. But this afternoon, as she cleaned, she also concealed the woman I knew by making herself look soft. Pink plastic rollers filled her hair. The smell of dabbed-on Florida water rose from her skin. Mike, her new boyfriend, was coming over. Our dish rack rested on the top of the refrigerator. There was no other place for it, and she handed me clean plates to stack there as I made my case. She leaned against the wall, seemingly exhausted, her long slip spotted with spray from the faucet. "Money's tight," she said. "You know that, Ty. I told you to get a job this summer, but you're hard-headed. A lazy boy does things twice." She shoved a fistful of wet utensils at my chest, but I just looked at them. I wanted to get my hair cut at the place Pop used to go to. I was 17 and had never been to a barber shop. Homegrown afros and cornrows all my life. Maybe I wouldn't know what to say once I got there. Maybe I had asked for the wrong thing or laughed at the wrong time, surrounded by all those clever men, grooming each other's masculinity. Still, even if I embarrassed myself, I felt ready. I was almost a grown-up, not a boy. Plus, tomorrow was the West Indian Day parade. This was the first time she was letting me go by myself. "If you're not going to help," she said, "get out of the way and quit breathing all over me." Now we both stared at the forks and knives clutched in her hand. "Ma, I need to look good." She shut off the water, jammed the utensils in the rack, and sidestepped by me. "Been doing this boy's hair all his life," she muttered. "I'll just cut it my damn self." She started banging around in the closet where we kept photo albums, boxes of discount toilet paper, and Pops' old winter coats. Next thing I knew, I was sitting in the living room with my shoulders draped in a towel. Here was the woman I knew, a force of nature, and I was totally helpless against her. Maybe, just maybe, some invisible force would steady Ma's hand, but who was I kidding? I had probably just stumbled again into that stagnant puddle of mud, belief. It was silly to think good things could possibly happen, but I had no choice. I described the style I wanted, picturing it as I spoke, a skin fade like Pops's, with the taper smooth and balanced, perfectly even all the way around, a timeless look. Ma wasn't even listening. She fumbled with the box, which had a white person cheesing on the front, proud of his bowl cut. "You sure you don't want one of those high tops?" She hovered her hand several inches above her head. "That looks easy enough to do." I began to fidget in a chair and make one more attempt. "All the guys from school go to the barbershop," I told her. "Trip's been going since before he could walk." "Like I give a damn about some fool who calls himself Trip," Ma said. "Trip. Trip ain't in this family. Trip ain't got to make the sacrifices we do." "Sacrifices. That's right, for your brother, and for you too. Don't you mean Mike?" The heat rose quickly on my ear after she hit me, my cheek stinging from her still moist hand. Though she yelled plenty at me, almost never at Omari, Ma rarely hit. Before she could scold me or hit me again, the intercom buzzed. Ma made her voice all sweet to call Omari and tell him to buzz Mike up. Then she started on my hair. Soon Mike walked in with a bottle of bright pink wine and his dopey grin. Ma got dopey in response and apologized for her appearance. "Always look good to me, babe," Mike said. He kissed her on the cheek and plopped down on the couch, the coffee table sandwiched tightly between us. Omari sat too, exactly where Pop used to relax with a beer and watch TV. "You keep nicking me," I said. Ma was being rough with the clippers. "Well, stop talking. Your whole head moves when you talk." "I'm not the retard here." "What did I tell you about saying retard?" Mike grinned extra big as he took in the show. "Ruth," he said, "you are truly a woman of many talents." Ma nicked me again when she laughed, and the clippers barked at every botched contact with my scalp. When she stood apart to take in her progress, they hummed in her hand. Mike said, "Boy, looks like he could be on TV, right, Birdman?" Omari's eyes shifted within the owls. He was smiling. Though shy around Mike, he didn't seem to mind him. This pissed me off, even though he was too young to remember when there had been a real man around. When Mike offered to add some finishing touches, I hopped up and hair rained from my shoulders. I rushed to the mirror by the front door. I couldn't believe what I saw. On top, a tall, crumbling brick of hair, edged by a jagged line, a sharp, wandering border. There was no fade, no taper at all. My mouth got tight, ready to curse loud and long, but Ma gave me a look that stopped me in my tracks. She said she wanted me to take Omari out for a while. "For what?" I said. "Because of him?" Mike spread his arms, a gesture that meant, "Don't you dare talk to your mother that way," at the same time that it said, "Hey, kid, just leave me the hell out of it." "You got a problem with that, Ty?" Ma said. I'm not the one bringing in problems. Do you pay the rent here? Do you pay any of the bills? I'm a grown woman and I work my ass off. I'll be damned if I can't have a friend over. Omari sang, everybody needs to have a friend. But I told him to shut up. I need to take another shower, Ma said wearily. By the time I'm done, I want you boys out enjoying the day. Or can we at least get some money, I asked. Ma went to the window and switched on the hulking air conditioner we rarely used. Be back in time to set the dinner table. 6 o'clock sharp. You'll be all right till then. When she shut herself in the bathroom, Mike flipped something at me. A quarter. In case you think about coming back early, he said, eyeing his bottle of wine. Go on and give us a call first. It was a hot, breezeless day, the air gauzy and wet. Though the sun was high in the sky, a lone and distant object, its energy came from everywhere at once. I wandered around the neighborhood, tucking down the bill of my Knicks cap. Omari trailed behind. Families walked from afternoon church service, sweating in their dress clothes. Fathers unbuttoned dark jackets from their paunches and slid down the knots of ties. One man with a bushy soul patch under his lip shouted for his little girl to stop running as she neared a corner. The weather was similar to when I'd gone to the West Indian Day parade with Pop. This was before he went away, when I was 7 and Omari was a baby. I heard Pop come in early Labor Day morning and get ambushed. Ma was yelling because he had stayed out all night. They argued like crazy and woke Omari. Then Pop came into my room, bleary-eyed, and told me to get ready. When we left, Ma was still screaming, and Omari was crying in her arms. The parade was heat and laughter, flags and floats, music so loud I felt it was shaking me more and more awake. I had my first taste of jerk pork there. I even got to pick the exact pieces I wanted from the vendor's smoking grill. After we ate, Pop lifted me to see over the crowd on Eastern Parkway. The women dancing in the procession were nearly naked, but plumed, with sprays of brilliant multicolored feathers. When I shifted my eyes away from their bodies, Pop laughed and told me it was okay to look. Mike's quarter felt warm and dirty in my shorts pocket. I was tempted to pitch it into a gutter. Omari muttered as he lagged behind me, walking with one foot on the sidewalk and the other in the street. I was melting in my cap, and here he was with that mask. He'd been wearing it since Mike began coming around. All of a sudden, Maud started acting girlish, humiliating herself. She even smiled in a ridiculous way, like she did in her pictures from high school. You could see all her teeth, and held like a tiny bud between them the bright red tip of her tongue. She crossed and uncrossed her legs with extreme awareness of herself, awareness that Mike enjoyed looking at her, delighted that he did, as if she were some other woman and not our mother. Okay, so that's the second piece I want to read for you. And then the last thing I want to read is really short. It should take about 4 or 5 minutes. And this is from the title story, A Lucky Man. So if the first story was focusing on 2 brothers, and this next story, also about 2 brothers, was focusing on how the narrator feels about his mother and his father, this piece is about an older man reflecting on himself and reflecting on his relationship with his wife. This is from A Lucky Man. Thank you so much for listening. When Lincoln met Alexis 22 years earlier, they were equals. He was as handsome as she was beautiful and bright. And despite their age difference, he had as much to expect from the coming years as she did. Lincoln courted her with a passion rooted in his certainty about himself. He'd been a good student and had excelled at boxing and football. His life had been full of prizes, trophies, and scholarships. He'd had more than his share of attention from women and had enjoyed the warmth and cheer of many men. He thought often about the question of what lay ahead in his life, but when he tried to see his exact outlines, he couldn't. It was indistinct with light. It had been this way with her, too. At Garfield's bar, he would tell his buddies how it hurt to look at her, and they would agree, mistaking his words for their usual hyperbole about women. On one of those nights at Garfield's, it occurred to him briefly that love was pain. When he was engaged to Alexis, and during their first years of marriage, his friends would tell him how lucky he was. But this was said as a joke. Lincoln would say thank you and agree, would tell them how grateful he was for her, but this wasn't true. He deserved her. This was what he believed, and he knew this was what his friends believed in. A man of a kind should get what he deserves, and if a man like him couldn't get a woman like her, then something was terribly wrong with the world. Do her friends tell her she's lucky? Lincoln wondered. Has her mother told her to give thanks for her man? She might be saying it now as they picked out plums and nectarines at the fruit market, or sat out on the porch shelling peas. But surely this was foolish thinking, just as foolish as thinking their daughter, Tamika, would spend these years breaking the hearts of any eager Georgetown boy who wasn't like her father. Lincoln came to understand that this had always been part of his vision for himself, to have children who adored him, a son who resembled and worshiped him, a daughter for whom no other man would ever measure up. This was part of what he couldn't see before he married. But there was no son, and the years of Tamika's life had marked his decline. She had grown up watching it. His professional gambles with the boxing gyms and the attempts at training and managing had failed. His charm and stature no longer earned him opportunities, and in New York, he had no reputation. He was lucky, he knew, to have his job, steady and respectable work. But years ago, he and his wife had deserved each other. Time had not treated them equally. Why did he expect otherwise, though? With any two people, one would get the brunt of it. And time had hit him worse than any beating he'd ever seen in the ring. He felt it had brutalized him. What did his wife think? Alexis had always been kind and supportive, but in her privacy, she had to keep thoughts. A long marriage forced you to witness or suffer such brutality. Lincoln wondered, not for the first time, if this was exactly what marriage meant. One day, his wife's looks would go. Creases would line her face, the skin there would loosen and thin, pouches would form under her eyes, maybe little dewlaps like his under the jaw. In her mind, it would start to slip and show weakness too. Everything cracks eventually. But when? How long would it be his good fortune to have her? How long until he could just plain have her again? Her smooth face. Even after all these years, he longed for it, to rub his cheek against hers and breathe hot words into her hair. There had been no diminishment of that feeling. He still had those appetites, and she did too. Yet he also felt the urge to press the sharps of his teeth against her face, to bite down and place the first deep crack in it. When pulled by contrary desires, you often don't do anything at all. So on evenings and weekends, he'd sit at home like a chastened boy, captive to her every small gesture. He didn't want to lose her. But Lincoln was a man with luck. Yes, he still had it. People said so, and they were right. Good fortune can change in an instant, however, or it might never. But whatever it does has nothing to do with you. For years it had persisted in following him. It went home from work with him, lived with his family, claimed a space between him and his wife in their bed. She still had her light, but his was his luck. If it left him, she would too. No one would blame her, neither her girlfriends, nor her mother, nor their daughter. Maybe people were wrong. Maybe Lincoln's luck had already abandoned him. His wife was gone now, after all. Or maybe Lincoln was the one with wrong notions. Maybe slumped in his chair at his desk, unable to muster the little strength it took to hold in his belly. It was his luck that he was alone with. Thank you.
Do you have time for questions? What's your favorite story you wrote?
The favorite story I wrote in this book, I actually don't have a favorite story, but I have a favorite story about a story. So the first piece that I read from, Everything the Mouth Eats, almost didn't make it into the collection. It was a story that I wrote during my first semester in graduate school at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I was in a workshop with the writer Marilyn Robinson. And she was not a fan of the story. And she had good reasons why. She had a good critique, but I wasn't ready to hear it. And the reason I wasn't ready to hear it is because this story is the one that was most emotionally challenging for me to write. So the fact that she didn't, jump up and praise the story was really hard for me. So in response to that workshop, and in response to her reaction to the story, I just kind of put the story away. I thought it was a failure, and it didn't work, so it was gone for years. I'd forgotten about it, and when my short story collection was sold to Grey Wolf Press, and I began editorial work with the editors there. I happened to be at a party with a friend of mine from grad school, and she was congratulating me on the book. She was so happy for me. And then she said, "I can't wait to see what you did with Everything the Mouth Eats." And I said, "Oh, that story's not in the collection." And she went off on me. She was really upset. She was very angry. She couldn't believe that this story wasn't in the collection. She was, her face was she was angry. And she said, "I've read, I think, almost all your work, but that's the story I think of when I think of your work. So I can't believe it's not in there." We talked about it a little bit more, so when I got home, I pulled the story out. I started looking at it. I looked at my notes. I looked at what Marilyn had told me, and it clicked. I got what she was saying 3 years later. And I worked on the story for about a month, and I emailed my editors and said, "I know we're underway with this editorial process, but would you look at another story that I have?" And he said, "Sure." So I sent them the story. I said, "It might be terrible, but here it is." And they read it in a day or two, and they said, "We love it. It has to be in the book." So I feel like it feels really good to me that this story, that again was really emotionally challenging for me to write, and that I had abandoned, sort of resurrected itself. It ended up being in the collection. And often when I talk to people, they tell me it's their favorite story in the book. So I don't know if it's my favorite story, but you get what I'm saying? The story of the story is my favorite. Yeah. Thanks for asking that.
I'll begin. These stories, as we've talked about some, but as you might have touched on in classes, are deeply concerned too with often featuring brothers. The protagonists are are always male, to really thinking about masculinity.
Yeah.
And if you could talk about some of the ways that you're envisioning masculinity in these stories and some of the challenges and possibilities
Yeah.
afforded to the men in these stories, men and boys in these stories.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're in an interesting moment right now with the Me Too movement and, sort of an investigation and a critique of toxic masculinity. That's purely a coincidence. I didn't write these stories knowing that we would be in this moment when the book came out. But I think it's fortuitous in a way because it allows me to think about that phrase, that term masculinity, and the phrase toxic masculinity. And my feeling is that, as boys and as men, we're sort of called to inhabit masculinity in certain ways that are harmful. But it need not be that way, and I truly believe that. And I think that toxic masculinity is an important term because it means that we can pull the toxicity away from masculinity. And it means that masculinity doesn't have to be a word that conjures up bad feelings, right? So in this collection, I think my investigation of masculinity has a lot to do with other terms that I think are related to it, and maybe not always put together with it, but terms like vulnerability and terms like intimacy, So intimacy between brothers, intimacy between friends, the way that a boy views his father or his mother, the way that a grown man views his masculinity with respect to the way his life is gone, the way that maybe he's having a tougher time than his spouse. So all these ways of investigating masculinity are important to me. I never wrote any of the stories thinking I was going to be thinking about masculinity, really. And it's sort of something more granular, something more, something, again, related to intimacy or privacy and vulnerability. All these terms are the ones that are more interesting to me. And maybe what I'm thinking about is the way that masculinity affects our ability to engage in those things, our ability to be intimate with each other, our ability to be vulnerable, and not have that be a bad thing, not have that be a thing that's about weakness, but about being about openness as an alternative. So, masculinity is one frame, but it's sort of the way masculinity affects all these other things that I'm really interested in. Yeah, thank you.
Your use of anger in your book, most of the people in your book
Came out, I'm sorry.
passive.
Passive. Yeah.
And I kind of wondered, and certainly the way you frame the stories,
Yeah.
passivity of your anger seemed to fit. But, and then the person who introduced you also talked about them being survivors.
Yeah.
So do you think at all about rage when you think of anger when you write your stories? Because there was no rage in your book. Was the rage long gone for these survivors?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there are a few moments of rage, I think, actually. So, for instance, I'm thinking of the boy Freddie who gets into a fight with his friend in the swimming pool, or the scene I read where the brother is sort of taking out his anger against his younger brother by playing roughly with him. So there are a few instances, but I take your point in that for a lot of these guys the anger or the rage is suppressed or it's passive. And I think I feel like I wanted to investigate both sides of that. I feel like I wanted to investigate those outward expressions of anger and those expressions of anger that kind of simmer, and perhaps are just as damaging as the outward expressions. And it's something that I can identify with. I remember, being a boy and being angry, but not feeling like I could express it, But that doesn't mean it goes away. That doesn't mean that it's still not poisonous, right? So what happens to that anger? What happens to that frustration? And I think that it expresses itself in other ways that are damaging to these boys and these men and their relationships, or challenge those relationships, So I think that, again, thinking in terms of masculinity, anger is an important term, right? That's often sort of attached to masculinity, anger and rage. And I kind of wanted to sort of examine like what these characters do with that, The younger brother in Everything the Mouth Eats is also angry, right? He also went through the same ordeal that his older brother did, but he's found an outlet for it by doing this martial art dance, right? His story is kind of a triumph because he's found a way to channel that anger and that rage into something that's beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for that. Yeah.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
And ever since I read Jamel, I'm so taken with the owl mask from the younger brother.
Yeah.
And so one of my questions for you is about kind of a relationship between masks and maybe trauma or struggle. But the other thing, I was like, just something was like itching. I thought I was like, it's Kuno Diaz. I was like, I think of him in your work, but I was thinking of his collection, Drown, the first story. And
Yeah.
Israel?
Yeah.
And then No Faith at the end.
Yep.
And sort of it's the boy who wears a mask to cover up the trauma done to his face.
Yeah.
And so I guess the second part of my question would be, what writers were really important to you?
Yeah.
As a young writer, and that you felt really inspired by.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So the first part of your question about the mask, the inspiration for the mask actually came from this film I really love called Killer of Sheep, directed by Charles Burnett. And there's a character in there, the main character's daughter, who walks around with a dog mask. And it's really, the visual is sort of stunning and arresting because, the dog's eyes are all askew and, she's got her fist stuck up under the mask. And it really looks like the mask it looks fake and real at the same time, And, as far as the relationship between the mask and trauma, I think, there is a relationship, of course. The thing that's interesting to me is that, Ty, the older brother, misunderstands why the younger brother is wearing the mask, right? He thinks it's because, Mike started coming around, right? But in fact, the mask is a response to Ty's anger, right? His own anger. I think that's about trauma, but I think it's also about being vulnerable or protecting yourself. Because one thing, I talked about this in one of the classes today, but one thing that's important about that opening scene is how small the apartment is. There's not a lot of space for any of them, the two brothers or the mom. So when Ty expresses his anger, there's no place for Omari to go, right? And if you don't have a place to go, you can't take refuge physically in any other space. You have to find some other way to take refuge, So when I was a kid and I felt like I needed to take refuge, it was with books. I sort of literally hid behind an open book, covering my face, burying my face in it. And for Omari, it's these sort of quirky habits, right? It's the mask, it's the imaginary friend, it's the newspaper clippings, all these ways of hiding but being creative at the same time, And I hope that addresses your question. And the second question about who I was thinking about when I wrote this, I mentioned this person in class today too. Edward P. Jones is tremendously important to me. He's a writer from Washington, D.C., His stories are set in Washington, D.C. And what I love about him is that no matter who his characters are and what they do, no matter how bad the things that they do, the stories always approached him with an attitude of love and affection. You never feel like he's judging his characters or he's looking down on them. And that's something that I really admire. The warmth of his stories is something that's really important to me. Other writers that I thought a lot about when I was writing this are Alice Munro, William Trevor, Yi-Yun Lee, all story writers primarily. And again, just the primacy of character in each of their works is something that I constantly try to learn from. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I have a question about luck, I guess.
Yeah.
So I haven't read the story, or like the short story, A Lucky Man, but I
Yeah.
read the other ones. And it wasn't until you were reading it now, and you said it was his luck that he was alone with.
Yeah.
That it strikes me as like a really negative connotation,
Yeah.
a pessimistic connotation,
Yeah.
which I think is really interesting because it strikes me as like an unchangeable fate. Is that how you're addressing luck? And I guess, was that your intent? And I guess with other stories that I've read, it seems like luck is an unchangeable fate. So is that how you're approaching luck, or are you trying to explore what it means to have luck?
Yeah, I think. Thanks for that question. I think I am trying to explore what luck means, and you're right that by the end of that section I read, it reads as sort of a negative thing, like a haunting presence, right? In every story, I kind of want luck to be read in both ways. It was really important for me to have at least one genuine moment of joy or happiness in every story, because the stories, by and large, are sad. So when you're reading luck, I want readers to take into account those happy moments. Right? Those moments that make you feel like you're lucky, you're a lucky person. Oh, I can't believe this happened. This is a wonderful thing that happened. But I also want readers to sort of read it ironically, right? That luck and the expectations that come with luck, or the ways in which having luck means that your success is not about you, it's just about fate or happenstance, is actually threatening to one's sense of self, especially as a man, right? So there's this sense that, there's the whole idea of the self-made man, right? Or this idea of men making their way, right? But if you're a lucky man, on the one hand, it seems good, right? Think great things are happening. But also if you're a lucky man, it means that you're just a man who happened to be lucky. So it's really not about you. Your success, the things that you gain in life are just things that were handed to you. And what does that do to your sense of yourself, right? When you can't claim that the triumphs of your life are because of your own strength or your own talent or your own skill, right? So always I kind of want that word to be visible, luck, but also like, on your Microsoft Word, when you can strike through a word, kind of like that too. So luck, but also luck crossed out. It goes both ways. It's a good thing, and it's potentially a threatening or a terrifying thing. Yeah.
I think we'll have to close this part down. Thank you all for coming here, and please join me in thanking Jamel for this.
Thanks.